In the autumn of 1931, 14 men walked into a mountain in eastern Kentucky carrying lamps, timber, and the particular kind of desperation that only $1.75 a day can buy. They believed they were digging for coal. They were wrong. What the drill bit into that season was not stone at all. It was a door, and doors, once opened at the wrong depth, do not always stay in the direction you left them. The old miners had a saying passed hand to hand, like a warning etched into a lunch pail. The ground talks down here. They meant it as comfort. They meant the settling, the groaning, the ordinary voice of rock cooling in darkness. But there is a second kind of listening that no foreman ever taught them. The kind where the mountain stops talking and starts waiting. And a man learns, too late, that silence underground is never empty. It is occupied. Somewhere past the cut face of a passage no company map had ever logged, a vertical shaft dropped into a dark no lamp could reach the bottom of. It grew, not by blast, not by drill, by something patient, wearing the stone smooth the way water wears a riverbed, except water does not choose its hour, and this did. One night watchman wrote 4 lines in a ledger before he stopped writing altogether. He described a sound rising from the deep works, not the crack of settling stone, but breathing, not one pair of lungs. He never went back inside that passage again, and neither did his handwriting ever look quite the same. 2 men vanished from that mountain within 11 days of each other. One left behind a lamp still burning. The other left behind a single boot, laces tied, leather unmarked, set down as gently as if someone or something had wanted it found. Tonight, Midnight Macabre takes you down into Beckett's Ridge, into the last dispatch of the men who sealed a hole in the world with their bare hands, and discovered 3 nights later that some doors do not stay shut. Some doors simply choose another way in. Welcome back to Midnight Macabre, the place where the lights go out and the truth crawls up to meet you. If this is your first night with us, dim the room, put in your headphones, and let the dark do what it does best. If you're one of the regulars who keeps coming back into the tunnel with us, night after night, knowing exactly what waits at the bottom and climbing down anyway, we see you, and we are grateful for the company. Tonight's story pulls from one of the strangest and least discussed chapters of Appalachian mining history. A coal operation that broke into a natural cave system it was never meant to find, and the men who paid the toll for that mistake. This one moves slow, the way real dread always does, not with a scream, but with a boot left tied on a passage floor, with a sound in a ledger that a grown man refused to write twice. Before we go under the ridge together, do 3 things for us. Subscribe to Midnight Macabre and ring that notification bell, because these stories go up in the dead of night, and you do not want to be the one who missed the next one. Hit like if this hook already put a weight in your chest. It tells us, and it tells the algorithm, that this story deserves to reach more people who need a reason not to sleep tonight. And in the comments, before you go any further, tell us your country and your city. We read every single one, and there is something strange and comforting about seeing just how far into the world this darkness has traveled to find you. Now, turn the volume up, because somewhere below the eastern passages of Beckett's Ridge, something is still keeping time with your heartbeat. Let's go down. There are nights, even now, when I wake to the sound of stone grinding against stone somewhere beneath the floor of the house I sleep in. And I lie still, with my heart slamming against my ribs, until memory catches up with my body and tells me where I am. I am not in Kentucky. I am not underground. The grinding is the wind, or the house settling, or my own mind rehearsing a fear it has never fully put down. I tell myself this every time. Most nights I manage to believe it. It was the autumn of 1931 when the Consolidated Coal and Iron Company broke a new drift into the eastern face of Beckett's Ridge in the hollows south of Macabre County and began hiring men at $1.75 a day. Enough in those years to make a working man quiet down every instinct his body owned. I was in my early 20s, 2 years removed from the Army, trained in engineering survey work, and carrying the specific, brittle confidence of a man who has not yet been shown what the world can contain. I was not hired as a miner. I was brought on as a ground man, the one who walks ahead of the crew with a chain and a lamp, mapping the new passages, measuring the seams, flagging what should not be trusted. I told myself the distinction mattered. I told myself a great many things that autumn that turned out not to be true. The foreman was a man named Aldous Prewitt, 52 years old, built like a door frame, with a jaw poured from concrete and pale gray eyes that had absorbed 30 years of underground work without once registering any of it as remarkable. On my first morning, he unrolled a map across the equipment shed planks and pressed one thick finger against the eastern extension. New passage opened 2 weeks back, he said, without looking up. Company wants it mapped before they lay track. He folded the map, handed it to me the way a man hands off a lunch pail, and walked away before I finished thanking him. 14 men worked the eastern crew. Most of their faces have gone soft in my memory over the decades, worn down the way a coin wears down in a pocket. But 3 have never faded, and I doubt they ever will. The first was Calvin Shores, a timber framer who read structures the way careful men read scripture, slow, deliberate, alert to what did not sit right. The second was a man called Dooley, 47 years old, who had worked coal since he was 14, and who delivered his opinions about the underground rarely, but with the flat certainty of a man who had already tested them against the dark and survived. Limestone country, he told me on my second day, knuckling the passage wall. Different rules than coal country. Different altogether. I wrote it down as an observation. I understand now it was a warning. The kind men who work underground have always given the new ones, not with alarm, but with a fact laid plain for whoever had the sense to hear it. The third was Bertie Falk, 19 years old, on his first season below ground, with a face that had not yet learned to hide anything it felt. He carried a composition book everywhere, the cheap kind, card cover, schoolchild pages, and wrote in it by lamplight when the work slowed. I have kept 2 pages from that book for over 50 years. I will read them to you before this story is finished. The eastern passages were unlike anything I had surveyed before. The company had cut into a natural cave system without meaning to. A joint-controlled limestone formation the geologists would later argue over. Broad, where the coal passages had been narrow, with ceilings that lifted to 15 feet in places. Pale gray stone, smooth as worked plaster, and an air current that moved through it, carrying a smell I can still summon on command, cold, mineral, ancient, like creek water, after a storm that happened before anyone alive was born. The men worked those passages without much talk, which was not, on its own, unusual. Coal teaches men to save their breath. But the silence in the eastern section felt different from any silence I had worked inside before. It had the particular quality of men who had already agreed, without a single word passed between them, not to say certain things out loud. It was Dooley who broke that silence first, and even then he chose his words like a man setting down something fragile. 4 days in, during the dinner break, sitting on a timber set with our lamps turned low to save fuel, he asked me without preamble, "You hear anything last night?" I told him I'd slept in the bunkhouse and heard nothing. He chewed for a long moment before answering. "Fella on night watch said he heard digging. Number 4, passage, far end." I asked what kind of digging. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down, the kind that stops when you go to look. Then he closed his pail and went back to work, and left me sitting there, staring at the dark curve of the passage, thinking about digging that knew when it was being watched. The foreman's night log confirmed it. 3 separate watchmen, across 3 separate weeks before I ever arrived, had written the same account. Sounds like digging or dragging, rising from a depth beyond the cut face. All 3 had walked to investigate. All 3 had closed their entry with the identical 2 words, "Nothing found. Nothing found." I underlined that phrase twice in my own notes, not out of alarm, out of the particular unease a trained surveyor feels when 3 separate men, weeks apart, arrive independently at the exact same lie. I want you to understand something about the wrongness that settled over Beckett's Ridge that autumn. It did not arrive. It accumulated the way cold accumulates in a body left too long in dark water, degree by degree, until you look down and realize you are far colder than you understood yourself to be. That is the shape this story takes. Not a jolt, a slow, patient tightening. On my 8th day, Calvin Shores found me at the survey table during the noon break and set his lunch pail down without opening it. That alone told me something was wrong. Calvin never once, in the weeks I knew him, skipped a meal. "You been down number 4 to the end?" he asked. I told him I had only mapped it as far as the cut face, which was the limit of my assignment. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a fear has just been confirmed rather than created. "I was past that this morning, into the natural section. There's a shaft down there we haven't logged." He paused, choosing the next words with visible care. "Goes down. Couldn't see the bottom." Then, quieter, "The edges aren't natural. Something worked them." We went together that afternoon, 2 lamps and my survey chain, and I saw exactly what he meant. The shaft was roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet across, dropping straight down into a dark our light simply could not follow. The rim was not drilled, not blasted, not cut by any tool I recognized from years of engineering work. It had been worn, smoothed by contact, repeated, patient, and coming, as far as either of us could determine, from below. I lowered my lamp on a rope to 40 feet and lost the light before I found bottom. Whatever waited down there did not want to be found by a man standing at the surface with a rope and a borrowed lantern. That, more than anything else, is what should have sent us home. It did not. Life in a Depression-era mining camp does not leave much room for instinct. The coal still had to come out. The $1.75 was still the $1.75. So we logged the shaft, flagged it for engineering review, and went back to work. And I have spent the rest of my life understanding exactly how much that single choice cost. The night watch that mattered most belonged to a man named Harlan Webb, 58 years old, a former railroad grader who had come to underground work late in life and had developed, across decades of night shifts, the specific stillness of a man who has already made peace with whatever the dark contains. At 2:40 in the morning, Webb's ledger entry records sounds from inside the mine as a whole, not the familiar tick and settle of cooling rock, but a deliberate, rhythmic displacement, as though something below the lowest levels was repositioning itself. He walked toward the eastern passages because the sound seemed strongest there. He stood at the mouth of number 4. He listened, and then he wrote the sentence that has never fully left me in 50 years. Heard breathing, deep in the works, not one pair of lungs. He returned to his stool at the drift entrance and did not go back inside until the morning shift arrived. I read that line the next day and stood at my survey table for a long time without moving. I told myself limestone acoustics are genuinely strange, that a single sound source at depth can bend and multiply through stone until it seems to come from everywhere at once. I told myself Harlan Webb was 58 and tired, and perhaps not the most reliable witness to underground phenomena. I told myself these things in the careful, deliberate way a man tells himself things he does not actually believe. Then I went down to the mouth of number 4 myself and stood there, listening for a very long time. Nothing, just silence and the smell of old water, and the pale walls going back into a dark my lamp refused to fill. I told Prewitt what the log said. He read it with the same flat expression he brought to everything underground and said only, "I'll have Dooley check the shaft before the shift." Dooley found me, after lunch, standing closer than his habit, keeping his voice low, which was not his habit either. "Shaft's changed," he said. "Wider. Maybe 8 inches around the rim. Edges are fresh worn." He looked at the wall beside us, not at me. Whatever wears those edges has been at it again. Recently. Then he walked back to the western passages and did not return east that day. I measured the shaft myself that afternoon and compared it against my own numbers from 4 days earlier. Dooley was right. It had grown, not dramatically, the kind of discrepancy that in any other engineering report would have earned a single flag notation and nothing more. But I had measured that stone with my own hands, and it had not been blasted, drilled, or touched by any crew on that mountain. I lowered the lamp again, 50 feet this time, still no bottom, and sat at the rim for what I estimate was 10 minutes, listening for something I could not have named if you'd asked me. What I got instead was a smell, the old water scent deepening, rolling upward with the slow regularity of something breathing far below. And beneath that, a sound, not digging, not stone shifting, something softer, wetter, and far more deliberate, the sound of something large, moving across stone with no urgency at all, as though it already knew it had all the time in the world. I climbed out and walked back to the surface at a normal pace. I remember being very careful about that. I remember understanding, without being able to explain why, that running would have been the wrong thing to do. That evening in the bunkhouse, I told Calvin Shores and Bertie Falk everything. The measurement, the smell, the sound. Calvin listened the way he always listened, processing rather than reacting, and Bertie's pen moved across the composition book with the focused urgency of someone who had been waiting weeks for a man to finally say the quiet part out loud. "The other men know," Calvin said when I finished. "They've known for a week. Nobody talks about it because there's no one to talk to who won't just tell them the ground is settling." He looked down at his hands for a moment. "It's not the ground settling." I asked him what he thought it was. "Don't know," he said. "Not animal, not natural cave movement. It responds to sound, the drilling, the blasting, the shift bells. Every time we make noise up here, within a few hours, there's noise down there. Not the same noise, a response." Bertie's pen stopped. "What kind of response?" he asked. Calvin's jaw tightened, the way a man's jaw tightens when he is deciding how much of a thought to say out loud. Like something asking a question, he finally said, or answering one. None of us slept well that night. I lay in my bunk, listening to the building and the ridge beneath it, trying to sort the sounds I recognized from the ones I did not, aware in a way I had not let myself be aware before, that whatever lived in the dark beneath the shaft was also, technically, beneath where I was lying my head down to sleep. 3 days later, the first man went missing. His name was Owen Frazier, 41 years old, a drill operator on the Western crew, quiet and reliable in the particular way men become after decades of doing the same dangerous work without complaint. He went down for his shift and did not come up for the noon meal. By the time Prewitt organized a search, Owen had been underground 7 hours with no contact from anyone. They found his lamp on the passage floor, still burning. They found his drill bag propped neatly against the wall beside it, set down, not dropped, as though he had meant to come right back for it. They found nothing else. The search covered both sections of the mine through the rest of that day and into the night. I moved through the eastern passages with Calvin and one of the older miners, and I noticed as we walked that number 4 felt colder than it had the week before. A current of air moving steadily from the direction of the shaft that had not existed when I first surveyed it. "Cold's coming up from below," Calvin said, holding a palm flat over the shaft mouth. I checked it with the thermometer from my survey kit. 11 degrees colder than the surrounding passage. Owen Fraser was never found. The county sheriff came out once, walked the site with the expression of a man confronting a problem entirely outside his vocabulary, took a few notes in a small pad, and left before noon. His official report concluded that Fraser had likely exited through an unmarked natural opening in the karst terrain and gotten lost in the timber above the ridge. He never came back to check. This is the part of the story that people who have never lived through a Depression-era coal camp find hardest to understand. Men died in mines, and men vanished in mines, and the coal still had to come out, and the $1.75 was still the $1.75. You did not walk off a job in 1931 over a feeling. A man who walked off a job in 1931 did not easily find another one. The company sent a replacement drill operator within the week. I watched him take Owen's place on the crew and felt something I did not have a name for at the time. I have a name for it now. Dread. The specific kind that comes from watching a machine keep running exactly as before, while everyone standing near it privately understands that something underneath it has already changed forever. 11 days after Owen Fraser disappeared, the mountain took a second man. His name was Russell Crane, 38 years old, a timber framer working alongside Calvin Shores on repairs the natural cave sections constantly demanded. Russell was careful, experienced, not a man given to carelessness, with a wife and 2 daughters in Williamsburg who expected him home every Sunday without fail. He went to work alone in the eastern number 3 passage on a Tuesday morning, replacing a set of compromised support timbers. By the noon break, he was not at the cookhouse. By afternoon, he was nowhere anyone could find. His tools sat exactly where he'd left them. 3 of the 4 timber sets had been repaired. The 4th stood propped in place, still waiting for its final securing nail, a task interrupted mid-motion, the way a sentence stops when someone walks out of a room mid-sentence and never returns to finish it. Calvin found what remained of Russell Crane, and he brought it to me before he brought it to the foreman. It was a single boot, leather, size 10, with Russell's own mark carved into the heel, an R and a C scratched there so his boots would never wander off the equipment shelf by mistake. The boot was whole. The laces were still tied, knotted the exact way a careful man ties his own boots before a shift, never the way boots come off a body in a struggle. Calvin had found it at the mouth of number 4, 3 feet from the shaft. Nothing else. No torn cloth. No blood. No sound reported from below. Just a boot, tied, set down, as if it had been placed there on purpose for someone else to find. I looked at that boot for a long time before either of us spoke. When I finally said we needed to tell Prewitt, Calvin's expression shifted into something harder than I had seen from him before. We tell Prewitt. He writes it in a ledger. The company sends a man who looks at it for one morning and calls it an industrial accident, and we go back to work, he said. And we do go back to work, I answered, because we have to. We carried the boot to the foreman's shack together. Prewitt set it on his desk, looked at it for a long, silent moment, and wrote a single line in his log. "I'm writing the regional office today," he said, requesting an inspection of the eastern passages. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had already written that exact letter more than once and received no answer any of those times. When I asked him directly what he thought was happening beneath us, he was quiet longer than I expected before he finally spoke. "I think there is something in those lower cave sections that isn't on any geological survey," he said. "I think it's been there a long time, and I think it's noticed us." He said it exactly the way he said everything, flat, final, without a trace of theater, which is precisely what made it so much worse to hear. That evening I sat down with Bertie Falk and asked to read what he'd been recording. His entries were far more precise than his 19 years should have allowed. Times, temperatures, careful descriptions of every change to the eastern passages since our first week. And there, in his own careful hand, was the pattern none of us had been willing to say aloud. In week 1, after Owen's disappearance, he had written, "Digging, rhythmic, from below." By the second week, movement, lateral, multiple sources, like something moving through a corridor. By the third week, around the time Russell vanished, the entry read only, "Not moving anymore." Waiting, waiting. I have spent decades turning that transition over in my mind, and I always arrive at the same conclusion, one I have never found a way to make comfortable. Things stop moving and start waiting only after they have already identified exactly what they are waiting for. It was Calvin who finally said the words none of us had allowed ourselves to say. He gathered 5 of us in the bunkhouse after supper, myself, Bertie, Dooley, an older engineer-minded miner named Walsh, and a seasoned Eastern Passage man named Garrett. "It comes up the shaft," Calvin said, without any softening at all. "Owen and Russell didn't get lost. They didn't fall. Something came up that shaft and took them. No one in that room offered another explanation. That, more than anything," Calvin said, "told me how long we had all secretly been carrying the same conclusion in silence." Walsh spoke next, slower than his habit. "My grandfather talked about something in the deep cave country of the Cumberland, old stories, older than Appalachian, Cherokee, and before that." He looked at the floor for a long moment. "Things that live in the limestone karst, their own passages, down where lights never once reached. The stories always said the same thing about them." He paused, patient. "That night, we decided what little we could actually do. Block the shaft, cap the number 4 entrance with timber and rock fill, and hope it slowed whatever was using that door to reach us. We went in that night, all 6 of us, carrying timber and planking, and Aldous Prewitt's silent, reluctant blessing." He looked at our plan and said nothing to discourage it, which from a man like him was closer to a warning than permission. We moved through the eastern passages in a tight column, lamps overlapping so that no man stood outside the light for even a step. Number 4 was colder than I had ever felt it, the air current from the shaft stronger, carrying that old water smell at a strength that made more than one man press a sleeve to his face without comment. We reached the shaft. The rim was exactly as I had last measured it, smooth, non-mechanical, patient. Calvin and Walsh began cutting timber to fit the mouth while I stood back with a lamp, watching the passage around us. Bertie stood beside me, composition book tucked under one arm, writing nothing, for the first time in weeks, just watching and listening. "You hear that?" he asked, very quietly. I had already heard it, rising from below the shaft, regular and slow and impossibly deep. A sound that was less a sound than a pressure in the chest, a subsonic resonance the stone itself carried up through the soles of our boots, rhythmic, deliberate, like something below us keeping time, patiently, the way you keep time waiting for a door to open that you already know is coming. "Work faster," I told Calvin. He looked at me once, understood completely, and turned back to the timber without a single wasted word. Garrett and Bertie held the planking steady. Dooley drove the wedges. Walsh packed rock, fill into every gap with his bare hands, working with the exact, unhurried precision of a man who has built things under real pressure before and refuses to let his hands shake now, of all times. The resonance from below never changed pace. It did not quicken. It simply continued. Patient, steady, endlessly certain of itself. It took 40 minutes to seal the shaft completely. When the last wedge was driven and the last handful of rock fill packed tight, Calvin pressed both palms flat against the timber cap and leaned his full weight into it, testing it. It held. The resonance stopped, not gradually, immediately, the way a sound stops the instant its source is cut off. Not the way an echo fades on its own. We stood there in that sudden, absolute silence for what felt like a very long time. No one spoke. We walked back through the eastern passages in the same tight column we'd entered with, and when we finally stepped out of the drift mouth into the cold night air above the hollow, several of the men simply stood still, breathing, staring up at the stars scattered over the black shape of the ridge. One man put his face in both hands and stayed that way for a long moment. No one said a single word about it. No one needed to. 3 nights passed with the mine running as though nothing at all had happened. Men going down, coming up, eating supper with the deliberate, performed normality of people waiting for something they refused to name out loud. The cap held, as far as anyone in the eastern passages could tell. The cold in number 4 remained, but the current from the shaft had noticeably thinned. Bertie wrote, in the careful hand I had come to recognize as his most honest voice. Perhaps we have given it something to think about. On the 4th night, something came through the wall, not the shaft. The shaft cap was exactly as we'd left it when we checked at dawn, but through a natural seam in the limestone on the north side of the main eastern passage, a crack no wider than 2 inches that none of my careful surveys had ever flagged as worth a second look. A crack that, as it turned out, had been sitting there, patient, the entire time we were busy sealing the wrong door. We knew, because of what waited on the passage floor the next morning. One single track, pressed deep into the fine silt, large enough that I laid my own hand flat inside it and could not reach the edges. The shape was wrong, in exactly the way Bertie's notes had been building toward for weeks, without either of us admitting it. long, with parallel impressions suggesting digits arranged in no order human anatomy allows, positioned as though whatever left it had been standing upright when it did. Aldous Prewitt crouched over that track for 4 full minutes without saying a single word. He did not try to name it. He simply stood, walked to the main junction where the men had gathered, and said the only sentence any of us needed to hear. We are pulling out of the eastern sections today. Western passages only, until further notice. Not one man argued. Not one man asked why. They looked at him, then at each other, and went quietly to work in the western passages, and none of them ever spoke of the eastern sections again. Not that week, not that season, not, as far as I know, for the rest of their lives. I left Beckett's Ridge before the winter came that year, along with most of the crew who had helped seal that shaft, and I have spent the better part of 53 years telling myself the version of this story where the cap held, where the crack in the north wall was simply a crack, where a single strange track in wet silt was nothing more than a trick of shadow and a tired man's imagination running loose in a cold passage before dawn. I do not entirely believe that version. I have never entirely believed it. Somewhere beneath the eastern face of that ridge, sealed behind timber that men my age drove into place with their own 2 hands, something patient is still keeping time in the dark, waiting the way it has always waited, for the next sound from above that tells it someone new has come back down to listen. I still have Bertie Falk's 2 pages. I still have the sound of stone grinding against stone, somewhere beneath the floor of every house I have slept in since. And on the nights it wakes me, I lie very still, the way I learned to walk very slowly out of that drift mouth all those years ago, and I remind myself of the one lesson that mountain taught me above every other. Some doors do not stay shut simply because you have decided to close them. They only wait for you to build a new one, somewhere you never thought to look.